Okay, good morning, everyone. Nice to see you all. I've put everyone on mute as per the normal model, but please feel free to unmute yourselves if you want to ask any questions. We were looking at the issue of Torah SheBaal Peh, the oral law, and trying to understand a little bit more about it. I think in the last couple of weeks we saw some of the very classic arguments that have been made already by the Gaonim and the Sefer Kuzari, who speak about the source for authority of the Torah SheBaal Peh found in the Torah SheBaal and other sources. These arguments that were put forward 1,000 years ago, particularly in defense against the attack of the Karaites, the Karaim, who denied the authority of the Torah SheBaal Peh. And we saw that there's a lot of evidence for a concept of Torah SheBaal Peh. Exactly what's included in the Torah SheBaal Peh, there certainly isn't evidence for. This is a matter of emunah ultimately. But the core concept of Torah SheBaal Peh, the idea that the written Torah doesn't contain everything, which can sound counterintuitive. I mean, if HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave us a Torah, why wouldn't he give us a Torah that includes everything? What's this strange model of a Torah which includes some of the information, and then we need another source to top it up? What would be this idea of a two-tier, volume Torah? So it sounds counterintuitive, and yet we saw both in the Torah SheBaal itself a lot of evidence that the Torah SheBaal is not all-inclusive. It can't possibly be all-inclusive. There's a need to come onto other information. There's a lot of information that's missing in the Torah SheBaal, and we saw examples of that. And in addition, we saw many thinkers across the generations who discuss why a concept of Torah SheBaal Peh is necessary, why a written Torah would be too limited. We discussed how in its most fundamental, all written works need an oral tradition associated with them. Torah in particular, the nature of Hebrew with its consonant-only alphabet, lacking vowels, the nature of the tamim, which aren't just the tunes used for laning, but also the punctuation notes of the Torah and affect the meaning significantly, and the whole concept of a Torah which on the one hand contains absolute values and on the other hand is meant to be merged and integrated with us and our personalities is what the idea of an oral Torah SheBaal Peh is about. So these are some of the ideas that we discussed over the last few weeks. But the truth is, we went into this discussion perhaps not yet having asked the most important question of all, which is, what is the Torah SheBaal Peh? What does it include? What actually do we mean when we talk about an oral Torah? How much is in it? Do we mean every word of Gemara and Rashi that we learn? Do we mean every Mishnah? Is it everything that's ever said in the Svaras, the reasons of Torah SheBaal Peh, the reasoning of Torah SheBaal Peh? Is this all included in Torah SheBaal Peh, or is it a narrower definition? Actually, what do we mean when we talk about an oral law? How much is included in it? Now, in truth, this should have been the first question, really, that we asked. Before we spoke about the authority of Torah SheBaal Peh and the source for Torah SheBaal Peh and the evidence for Torah SheBaal Peh, we should have defined terms. What do we mean when we talk about an oral Torah? What's included in it? I didn't do so because it made sense logically to first sort of build up what's exactly included. But the truth is, this is the most fundamental question, and the question really that, in a sense, I wanted to focus on. What exactly do we mean by Torah SheBaal Peh? What exactly is included in Torah SheBaal Peh? So to start the conversation, I want to actually go in a non-historic direction, and I want to give a quote from one particular fairly recent thinker, just because it's a clear exposition of one stance which could be adopted. We'll see shortly that, in truth, the parameters of Torah SheBaal Peh are a subject of significant debate. There's many different opinions on the matter, a whole range of viewpoints. And indeed, it's possible that in Chazal themselves, there's some disagreement about this matter. However, I want to start off with a line from Samson Raphael Hirsch, Rav Shimshon Raphael Hirsch, who presents one particular stance in form, and it's just a good way, I felt, to start off the conversation. And this is a quote from Samson Raphael Hirsch in his commentary to Shemos, to chapter Kaf Aleph, Perek Kaf Aleph of Shemos, and he says that the written Torah is to the old Torah like the relationship of short notes on a full and extensive lecture on any scientific subject. So what he says is as follows, and he goes on to elaborate, that if you sit in a complex talk, a complex lecture on a technical subject, and you are students listening to it and you write notes. So for the student who's been there and heard the whole lecture, the short notes are sufficient to act as an aid memoir to bring back afresh to the student's mind the whole subject of the lecture. So for the student, a little dash or a work or a question mark or an exclamation mark, an underlining might be sufficient to recall a whole series of thoughts that were shared in the lecture. However, for someone who hasn't been to the lecture and hasn't heard the original talk, such notes would be completely useless. There's no way they could reconstruct the talk on the basis of these notes. Only once one knows the information are the notes useful as a reasonable and instructive guide to working out the information, the wisdom that's being shared. So in this model, Torah SheBaal Peh is incomprehensible, unscrutable in its own right. There's no way to construct from Torah SheBaal Peh, from the written Torah, everything that a Jew needs to know, all information that we need to have. The most that Torah SheBaal Peh can be is as an aid memoir. It's notes which, after I know the information, I can look back and say, this is where it was written. So if I know, and if I'm privy to the lecture, if I've been makabel, if I've received the Masorah of Torah SheBaal Peh, argues Samson Raphael Hirsch, then I can look back in the Torah SheBaal Peh and say, yes, this is where this is written, and this is where that is written. However, the information itself can't be recreated from the text. So if I want to look at the text, and I want to see how the text says and informs me of this vast amount of information in Torah SheBaal Peh, that's a quest that I'll never be successful in. I can't expect to be able to derive from Torah SheBaal Peh, from the written Torah, the full amount of information in the oral Torah, the Torah SheBaal Peh. The most I can do is, now that I know Torah SheBaal Peh, i.e. I've heard the lecture, and then I can look back and see how this is alluded to in a comma, in an exclamation mark, in an underlining, in a dot, in the student's notes, which is Torah SheBaal Peh. Now, I'll label this, in a sense, a maximalist position. If we think of this as a spectrum of perspectives on what Torah SheBaal Peh is, here we have one stance which argues that everything in Torah SheBaal Peh, this is a huge amount of data, was transmitted orally to Moshe. And the relationship between the text and all this oral tradition is not one of Peshat. We're making a mistake when we're learning the book, the Torah, if we think that out of a simple reading of the text, we can derive the whole of Torah SheBaal Peh, because it was never meant to be read as a text in that form. Torah can be read on many levels. It can be read on the level of Peshat, and it will tell us certain information. But if we want to understand the full halachic content of the Torah, we can't expect to read it as Peshat. That would be like trying to read a computer program as if it's a story. So if you've never met computer text and you try and read it as if it was a narrative, I'm not up to date with the latest rules of programming language, but when I learned BASIC many, many years ago, you may have a line which says 10, print hello, 20, go to line 40, or whatever it may be. You could think it's a story, and it'd be a bit of a strange story. 10 print hello, so 10 people printed hello. 20 go to line 40, so you could read it as a story. You'd be misunderstanding the whole nature of the text. Similarly, if you found a student's notes from a lecture and thought that out of those you could construct a whole sentence, that would be a mistake. The student never set out to write the whole sentence. So what is it? It's notes from a lecture. And this is what we call the 13 principles that Rabbi Shmuel was Dorish the Torah with, and the various other rules of being Dorish Torah. Anyone who learns Gemara is familiar with drashas of Chazal, where they take psukim and they analyze the psukim, and they derive or draw out certain halachas. And often their readings of the text are very counterintuitive to our ear. They don't seem to be a reasonable working version of the psukim to us in the 20th, 21st century as we read these Mamori Chazal. we hear a certain coherence. Very often we'll read the drosha and we'll understand it's a very careful, nuanced reading of the text with a diuk and with insight and so on, but sometimes it's completely incomprehensible to us. Because there is shava. It says a word here and it says a word there, and somehow that acts as a hyperlink between the two sections of the Torah. So you have the same unusual words in two parshas, and somehow that acts as a bridge which transfers across halachas. Now, in most other works that we read, they don't read like that. That's not how you can read a text. You wouldn't read a story and expect to have to translate across from chapter to chapter based upon the use of the same sort of word. And so on many of the rules, klalo prata klal, we say this at the end of Birchas Hashach every day, after which we say Kaddish Rabban. If there's a more inclusive language and a less inclusive language and then a more inclusive to include things like this and other things like this, it doesn't function like any text that we're familiar with. Says Samson Raphael Hirsch, that's because it isn't that usual sort of text. We're making a mistake when we're reading it about what sort of genre of literature it is. If you remember right at the beginning of our discussion of Torah SheBaal Peh, I pointed out that every book really needs a Torah SheBaal Peh, an oral tradition about what sort of work is it. I mean, some books maybe are ostensibly clear, but many books of fiction, the whole pleasure of reading a book of fiction is that it's written as if it's true. You read a thriller or a spy novel or a detective story, and the whole point is that it's true to life. It's not Harry Potter. It doesn't include magical stuff. It includes stuff which maybe is unusual in the world, but stuff that could take place. And that's the whole pleasure of it. You immerse yourself in experience, and therefore you go with the thrills and the nerves and the excitement of what's going to happen, because it's written ostensibly as a true story. And there's nothing in the book itself that gives away whether it's fiction or fact, other than, in a sense, the Torah SheBaal Peh, the understanding of what the nature of the literature is. So whenever you read a text, you need to know what its nature is. And we've made a mistake about Torah when we think that the halachic reading of Torah can be read as a novel. The halachic reading of Torah has to be read as students' notes. And more than that, it can't be used to derive the halacha from it. It's once Chazal know the halacha, know the tradition, they then show us how this is revealed in the student note text through the what's called the Hermeneutical Principles. I never quite know what the word hermeneutical means. It's one of these words. It's only used in the context of Torah studies. It's one of these translations that doesn't help that much. It's a bit like tefillin or phylacteries. Someone says to you, what's tefillin? You say the phylacteries. Then if you're much the wiser by hearing that translation into English. So Rabbi SheBaal has his Yud Gimel Midas, Torah and Drashas, the principles of Droshas, hermeneutical principles. These means, joking aside, that means principles of reading language. But Samson Raphael Hirsch argues that these aren't principles of deriving halacha, they're principles of showing how already known halacha is alluded to in the notes, the student notes, which is the Torah. I'll come back to this analogy later, but we are aware that our tradition tells us that Torah can be read on numerous levels. Paradus, it can be read on Pshat, Remez, Drush, and Soid. And in a sense, this is what's going on over here. Let me just give an analogy. Imagine a brilliant computer programmer who managed to write a piece of programming that both worked, so it did whatever he was designing it to do, but could also be read by the uninitiated as a story. And I already gave the example, 10 print hello could mean something. It could mean 10 people print as hello. 20 go to 40 could mean something. So imagine a brilliant programmer who wrote a text that could read like a novel to someone who read the story, but to a programmer would be understood as programming and making something happen. Imagine now, more than that, imagine that the story and the narrative of the novel fitted with what the program caused to happen on the computer screen, somewhat. So you could read a story which told you that Jack walked along the road holding an umbrella up and it was raining. And in the computer programming language, that's what it says if you read it as a story. But if you read it as a computer programmer, what will it do? It'll make an image on the screen, walk along with someone holding an umbrella as they walk through the rain or whatever it might be. So there's a line-up and an accordance between these different levels of reading the story. And we can multiply this by example. Maybe an even more brilliant programmer could write a program that in one computer language would cause someone to walk along holding an umbrella up, and another computer language would act as a weather forecasting program. And therefore, on every level of reading it, it talks about similar themes, but on the novel level, it tells us an artistic story of the experience of walking in the rain. On one computer language, it shows an image of someone walking in the rain, and another computer language, it tells us about rain patterns. So it can be read on multiple levels, all of which are similar and sort of deal with the same issues, but they deal with them in different ways and in different levels. So something like that is the analogy of how we view the text of the Torah. It wasn't just written by any old brilliant computer programmer. It was written by HaKadosh Baruch Hu himself, the great programmer, the capital G, capital P. And therefore he wrote it in a level in which it can be read on these numerous levels, in which it can function both as Peshat, as a narrative and a story, and also as Remez, and also as Drush, and also as Toid, the various secrets and levels of reading Torah SheBaal Peh. But what is the nature of reading it based upon drushas that we're seeing in Chazal? The answer is reading it to the level in which it functions as student notes. Now, this is one particular stance, one particular way of understanding Torah SheBaal Peh, and it fits in, and we'll see later, it's in line with perhaps certain Mamori Chazal, but there's also other ways of viewing it. What are the positives of this model? Well, it preserves perhaps the traditional, simplest way that perhaps many of us have been brought up with, of understanding what Torah SheBaal Peh is. Torah SheBaal Peh is oral traditions. I mean, that's the literal translation, Baal Peh, orally transmitted traditions. And they were written down because they were going to be forgotten due to persecution by Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi some 2,000 years ago. And then the Gemara developed around it, which is a layer of explanation of the Mishnah. And this is, in many respects, a familiar way of understanding Torah SheBaal Peh. What are the challenges to this model? Well, first of all, it means a huge amount of data was transmitted over the generations, a vast amount of data. Secondly, it means that machlokas, all the arguments we find in the Gemara, must be a level of corruption or loss of Torah SheBaal Peh. And certainly in this model, we need to challenge ourselves to think about the reliability of the tradition that we've received. I mean, what happens when you see so much machlokas in the Gemara? How do you handle all of that? And how can we trust a system which involves transmission of so much data? And the truth is, and this is already pointed out really by the Rambam, and we'll get to this later, there's an unbreakable paradox over here, which there's no resolution of. It's like scales. As one side goes up, the other side goes down. If you adopt a maximalist position of Torah SheBaal Peh, let's say as per Samson Raphael Hirsch, that everything that we have of Torah now is part of an oral tradition, then the inevitable price that you pay for that is that there's no machlokas without a loss of this Torah. If everything was part of the corpus of transmitted Torah, then every machlokas that exists is some loss of this oral tradition. More than that, when we learn Gemara, the drushas of Chazal are in a sense an illusion. And it doesn't really look like that when you learn Gemara. It's certainly not the pashtus of learning Gemara. When you learn Gemara, it looks like the Gemara is trying to derive laws. I mean, this is a classic structure of a Gemara. A Mishnah will state a halacha, and then the Gemara will ask, Minah hani mili, Aramaic, from where is this information from? You know, where does this come from? And then the Gemara will perhaps bring a drasha to give a source, or perhaps not. Perhaps it'll say it's a drabanon, perhaps it'll say it's a piece of reasoning, but very often the Gemara will give a drasha. It will learn it from a derivation from a text found in the language of the Torah. But in truth, according to Samson Raphael Hirsch, it's not really derived from there. In truth, it's a piece of oral tradition. And all the Gemara is saying is that this can be alluded to or seen in the student notes, which are the text from this and this source, but not that it can be really derived from there. So the translation of Minah hani mili isn't where does this come from, but where can these matters be found? In other words, how do we see these ideas alluded to in the text of the Torah, but not that they're really derived from there? And it doesn't look like that, certainly at first glance, when one learns Gemara. I'll just take the first page of Sukkah, perhaps, as an example. So the first page of Sukkah discusses the halacha, that a machlokas, first of all, an argument. Can a Sukkah be higher than 20 amos or not? 20 amos is about 30 to 40 feet, so it's very high. The Mishnah there discusses the maximum height of a Sukkah and the minimum height of a Sukkah. And it turns out it's a machlokas, Rabbi Yehuda and the Rabbanon. The majority opinion, which is what we follow, is that a Sukkah can't be higher than 20 amos, 30, 40 feet. And the minority opinion, Rabbi Yehuda, is that it can. And then the Gemara discusses derivations from various psukim about why the majority view would be that it can't be more than 20 amos. And it looks like the Gemara is deriving it from the source. It says one reason is because of the language of psukim, one reason is because of the manier there. And the Gemara gives a whole load of different sources for this opinion. Definitely looks like this is a machlokas, in which they're arguing about how to learn and how to derive halacha from the psukim. So this is the second challenge to this maximalist position. A third challenge is that it turns out that there's in truth no real Chiddush Torah. When Rav and Abaya, or for that matter, Reb Chaim Soloveitchik, say a Chiddush Torah, a piece of new Torah insight, all they are doing is really quoting tradition, or perhaps, at best, maybe rediscovering tradition. There's no genuine innovation in Torah. There's no genuine possibility of Chiddush, of deriving a new idea or insight into halachic or theological matter. But this is the stance that Samson Raphael Hirsch adopts. Now, how would he deal with the reliability of tradition and with the problem that surely every page of Gemara is full of machlokas? I mean, one can open any random daf in Gemara and no doubt find several machlokas there, and then certain more than one. I don't mean this literally every daf, but vast majority of dafim in Shas contain arguments. How, therefore, can we rely on the tradition? Well, the truth is, and this is a very, very fair point to make, that machlokas is almost invariably round the edge. Gemara is fascinated by exploring boundaries, exploring the breaking point. Gemara is a very conceptual system of learning. And when you want to learn a concept, you want to draw it to its outer parameters. You want to draw it to its outer edge and see how far you can stretch it. I mentioned on last Wednesday night when we were learning together the Parsha, we were learning Parsha's Masei, and there the Torah defines the borders of the land of Israel, of Eretz Israel. And I mentioned that historically defining borders is not something that was really done in the past. We live in a very black and white world, a very on and off digital world. And we're used to the idea that if I stand on 1 millimeter, I'm in France, and another millimeter, I'm in Germany, either side of the border. But in the past, they didn't think like that. It was clear where Eretz Israel was. It's clear where the lands of Egypt was. And between was a desert. There was a sort of no man's land, and no one really cared about. And no one ever exactly thought about the definition of the border. That's not how Torah works. Torah is fascinated by borders. And in that sense, it's a very modern mindset. And the whole of Torah works like that. You have you eat a portion of matzah, and you eat 1 gram, 1 crumb below the required share. You haven't done anything. You haven't done the mitzvah. You eat 1 crumb more, and you've done the mitzvah because you've crossed the threshold. So on Kippur, and you've eaten a certain amount of food in 2.5 minutes, and you've got a problem. You eat it in 3 minutes, and you haven't transgressed 1 Torah law. You've only transgressed a lesser Torah law, and therefore someone's ill. That's the better thing to do, and then so on and so forth. So the whole structure of Torah is very defined. We always take this for granted when we learn Gemara. But this certainly wasn't the mindset really till modernity, till the Enlightenment and onwards. And this is probably one of the reasons why Jewish thinkers were so influential in the forming of the modern mindset, because this is a very Jewish way to think. It's a very Talmudic way to think, to define things to their most extreme boundary. And when one learns Gemara, one sees this again and again. Gemara will often deal with what looks like a very far-fetched case. And one wonders, why is the Gemara dealing with a far-fetched case? And the truth is, we do this in science and mathematics because this is the best way to think conceptually. No one is claiming that in real life it's like it. Let me give you an example in maths. Every maths equation assumes a perfect circle or a perfect triangle or a perfectly straight line or a perfect spot of no dimensions, a dot of no dimensions. Now, in the history of the universe, there has never been and there never will be a perfect circle. A circle which is perfect down to the atomic level is very, very unlikely. A circle which is perfect down to the subatomic level, now we know is impossible due to quantum mechanics. So there never was and never will be in the history of the universe a perfect circle, or a perfectly straight line, or a perfect dot which has no dimensions, and so forth. Now, in real maths, in real mechanics and engineering, one needs to deal with that. But in maths, when one's trying to draw the principles, one thinks in terms of abstract concepts, which we simplify down to removing all extraneous circumstances to try and get to the core of the matter. And it's the same in science. If you want to understand how an object falls, if you try and look at a real object, it's too complicated. Ends up with air resistance and air pressure and so on and so forth. We don't even have the computer models that can do these things with the accuracy that we need. So in the theory of physics, we'll create something in lab conditions, and we'll remove the atmosphere, and we'll have a vacuum to test it. But then in real life, we'll need to build a wind tunnel and check how it actually works. And it's exactly the same with Torah. Torah removes, in the Gemara, it will remove all extraneous elements, even though in order to do so, you need a rather artificial and unlikely case study. And then it will bring the elements back in order to get it into real life, in order to show how it works in actuality in the real world. And the truth is, when one learns Gemara, as a result of this, one can come away with the impression that everything is up for argument. There's arguments about everything, and it sort of throws one if one takes the Samson of Al-Hash model. Well, then what do we know of the Masorah? How accurate is the Masorah at all? But the truth is not like that. There's very little argument over the core definitions of what something is. So we know what a sukkah is. We know what Arba Minim is. We'll then stretch it to the limit. How small can a sukkah be? And the answer is revealing. The smallest sukkah is 10 tefachim high. How high is a 10 tefachim high sukkah? The height of a table, 80 centimeters. So no one really ever in normal life would build a sukkah like that. 20 amas high is a sukkah of 40 feet or 30 feet high. It's a very, very high sukkah. No one builds a sukkah like this. It's much higher than the normal height of a schach that you would ever have in a normal house or in a normal building. So in the history of the world, how many sukkahs are actually built like that? So the edges, the boundaries ended up as machlokas. There's no argument between Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbanon about what a normal sukkah looks like. In day-to-day life, they were building identical sukkahs. And in practice, how often is the shaila ever asked about a sukkah which is 80 centimeters high or 30 or 40 feet tall? Almost never. So what we think of as machlokas and halacha and the Gemara and so on, is actually not true. The core concepts of Torah SheBaal Peh are almost invariably not a machlokas. It's the boundaries, the outer boundaries that we stretch. This is how Samson of Al-Hash would view the topic. He would say the Masorah itself is very accurate. It contains the data, the vast majority of data that we have in Torah SheBaal Peh. Here and there, there's machlokas over tweaking things around the edges where the tradition got lost. And we need to understand that the relationship between Torah SheBaal Peh and Torah SheBichsav is not one of derivation. Can't expect to learn Torah SheBaal Peh out of the written Torah. You can't learn Torah SheBaal Peh out of the written Torah. So Samson of Al-Hash, after you hear the idea, after you attend the lecture, you can look back and find this in the student note. This is his model. Now, I want to make one comment, and I say this comment with a lot of hesitancy and tentativeness. It is always dangerous speculating on the historic influences on great thinkers. And it's dangerous for lots of reasons. It's dangerous because we're not just simply products of our time. So it is true, no doubt, that any view that any of us would express would be affected by our flourishing in the 21st century. But equally, that doesn't mean that we all take identical stances just because we're all products of 21st century London, for example. So one has to be very careful when one gives historical explanation of great thinkers' viewpoints, number one. Number two, what we look for in great thinkers is something ahistorical. We want something above the exigencies and the circumstance of history. We hope that great thinkers touch upon truths which are beyond just an expression of the particular time and place that they found themselves in. And certainly when it comes to Torah, Torah should be offering us values and ideas which aren't just an expression of contemporary, a particular era in history or a particular time. So it's always a little bit dangerous trying to historicize a thought of a great thinker. It's a recipe for superficiality and jumping to conclusions, and a lot of the stuff that, certainly from the point of view, I'm fascinated by science, I'm fascinated by philosophy, I'm fascinated by lomdus and halachic structure, and a lot of the stuff that I read in historical research, in which the explanation of views are proposed based upon historical settings, are sort of miss the crux of the argument and are a little superficial. With that introduction, and all that said, I'm now going to slightly contradict myself and very tentatively and humbly point out that Samson Raphael Hirsch is expressing this viewpoint in the context of 1800s Germany, when of course orthodoxy is under attack from reform, and a big area of attack is Torah SheBaal Peh, the oral tradition and the authority of the oral tradition. Early reformers, many of them wanted to adopt a stance, a sort of neo-Karaite stance, in which they said, you know what, we'll accept the written Torah, but we don't want all these additions that the rabbis have come up with in the Mishnah and the Talmud. And Samson Hirsch, of course, is the great defender of orthodoxy. And the position he adopts, if you go for it, is one that does so successfully. Because there's quite the contrary, you're putting the horse before the cart. It's not Torah SheBichsav, which is the main text, it's really Torah SheBaal Peh, which is the main text, and Torah SheBichsav is the notes, the student's notes. But if all you're going to buy into is Torah SheBichsav, is the written Torah, then you're like someone who refuses to attend a lecture and only looks at the student notes, and your chance of discovering truth is zero. This is a ridiculous approach to try and know what the word of God is, to understand what Torah wants from you. So again, I'm not here retreating into historicism and suggesting that this is why he says it, and the only influence on why he says it. He is a great thinker and deserves to be taken seriously in his own right. Nonetheless, the context of the statement is one in which there's effectively a neo-Karaite attack, if you like, on Torah, and therefore this is the argument he puts forward. The most sort of punchy one-liner expression I've ever heard of this line of argument was put forward by Rabbi Victor Miller in America, in which he said, they call us the people of the book, but the book, this is the expression people of the book, of course, is referring to the context derived from Muslim sources, but he's using it as a catchy phrase to say. He says, but the book isn't the Torah SheBaal Peh, isn't the Chumash, the book is the Talmud. So when we say we are the people of the book, which book do we mean? We mean the Talmud rather than the written Torah. So this is a way of bringing out that if you're going to, try and separate the two Torahs, this is ridiculous. Torah SheBaal Peh, on the contrary, Torah SheBaal Peh's authority in certain respect derives from Torah SheBaal Peh, not the other way round. And in many respects, this is true and inarguable. This is an extreme formulation of the position, but the core idea that Torah SheBaal Peh is incomprehensible without Torah SheBaal Peh, we saw already. No one would argue with Samson Raphael Hirsch on a minimalist stance. We've seen things like Shechita and Tefillin and Mikveh and Tchum Shabbos and many hundreds of examples. There's no doubt there's a very important element of Torah SheBaal Peh which is incomprehensible without Torah SheBaal Peh. But the question is the maximalist model, which is extended to every detail found in the Gemara. So I start off with this position simply as a way of opening the conversation and presenting one polar extreme simply as a way of anchoring ourselves in where the discussion will range. Because if we take him as sort of one position, the maximalist position, what we're going to look at is who else adopts such a similar maximalist position, and then what would the alternative viewpoints be? And we'll look maybe at some versions of more minimalist tradition till we get to, more minimalist stance rather, till we get to the view of the Rambam, Maimonides, who adopts if you like, a very minimalist position. Just to again define the terms, a minimalist position would be a position in which the majority of Torah SheBaal Peh is derived from what it looks like on the page of the Gemara, human reasons, human attempt to understand the written Torah. So if we have a minimalist position, the most minimal you can go and still be loyal to Jewish tradition is a position in which you accept certain information has been handed down from Sinai. There's no model in which nothing has been handed down from Sinai. We saw already the Torah references oral traditions when it comes to Shechita, when it comes even to the text of the Ten Commandments, many, many important things. The Gemara makes reference to the idea of Halacha and Moshe Sinai, a tradition from Sinai. That's the minimalist position. But everything else that looks like an argument in the Gemara looks like an argument because it is an argument. It was great Rabbonim, Tanoim and Amoraim, reasoning and trying to derive halacha and insight from the Torah, using a certain way of thinking, which we refer to as Rabbi Shmuel, the Hermeneutical Principles, the principles of learning Gemara, and so on. So this will be a minimalist position. The minimalist position will raise lots of questions also. Well, if this is just a bunch of rabbis reasoning, what's their authority? Why should we listen to it? How do we know it's reliable? What then happens before Torah SheBaal Peh, before Gemara is written? What did Judaism look like? So there's lots of questions in the minimalist position. The opposite extreme, the maximalist position, will say, no, everything that we have included in Torah SheBaal Peh is part of the tradition that was handed down to Moshe at Sinai. Again, there's an unbreakable paradox in these two positions. You adopt the maximalist position, in a sense, you up the authority of Torah SheBaal Peh, the source of Torah SheBaal Peh. It all comes from Sinai, from Halacha and Moshe Sinai. But the price you pay is there's no room for chiddush, no room for innovation in truth, and more than that, the reliability therefore is based upon the Masorah, on the tradition. You adopt the minimalist position, then it raises a different set of questions. This is a scale which is unbreakable. One stance goes up, the other goes down, and we need to try and tunnel our way out of this paradox in order to be able to confidently relate to Torah SheBaal Peh, to the oral Torah, and understand what it is. I'll mention just before I go further that there is a uber maximalist position, a position even further than Hirsch, and I'll tell it to you because it's a fascinating one. It dates from a halachic work that predated the Rambam himself. The Rambam is famous for his list of 613 mitzvahs. The whole topic of 630 mitzvahs really is a share in its own right. We're not going to go into it in this series. We need to look at its own right. But for now, let's just take as a given that there are 613 mitzvahs. And the Rambam, very famously in his book of mitzvahs, Sefer Mitzvahs, written in Arabic, lists these 613 principles. Now, the Rambam wrote an introduction to his list, which is almost as long as the list itself, in which he writes the rules he took of how to define 613 mitzvahs. Because it may sound like a very simple endeavor. We'll just list the 613 mitzvahs. I mean, what's the problem? Go through the Torah and count them up. And what's the issue? What's the complication? But it is more complicated than that. For example, we put on tefillin shel rosh and tefillin shel yad. Tefillin on our head, tefillin on our arms. Does that count as 2 mitzvahs or 1 mitzvah? That's a very interesting question. You just need to read the 10 commandments, and you will see that the 10 commandments consist of many more and many less than 10 mitzvahs. The first of the so-called 10 commandments, of course the word 10 commandments is not a commandment, it's Aseret HaDibros, 10 statements. The first of them is a statement, Anochi Hashem Elokecha, I am the Lord your God. Is that a mitzvah, or is it just an introduction? Does it mean believe in me, which is how the Rambam takes it, or is it just an introduction? And then we have the continuation of the 10 commandments. You shouldn't have other gods, you shouldn't bow down to them, you shouldn't worship them. Does that count as 1 mitzvah or 3 mitzvahs? Is there a difference between having other gods? Don't worship them. Don't bow down to them. Is that 3 commandments or 1 commandment? So the concept of listing the mitzvahs is not as simple as it might sound at first glance. And therefore the Rambam wrote a lengthy introduction in which he explains the rules he used to determine what should be listed as mitzvahs or not. In this introduction, he attacks the view of a predecessor of his, and now listen carefully, who, believe it or not, listed rabbinic mitzvahs, mitzvahs d'Rabbanon, amongst the 613 commandments. Fascinating idea. Mitzvahs d'Rabbanon. In other words, we're here discussing Torah SheBaal Peh, the oral Torah. We're not discussing open and acknowledged mitzvahs d'Rabbanon. No one thinks that these mitzvahs come from Sinai. Hanukkah, well, of course Hanukkah doesn't come from Sinai. Hanukkah is an event that took place roughly 300 years, 250 years before the Common Era, long after the cessation of prophecy. We know that. And we know why we light Hanukkah candles, because an historic event happened and the rabbis created the Rabbanon. We read Megillah on Purim, we light Shabbos candles on Erev Shabbos. We know who made these. These are Rabbanons. There's no doubt about them. No one ever claims that these are from Torah SheBaal, from the written Torah, from the old Torah, handed down to Moshe from Sinai. And yet, this figure, great figure, Pri the Rambam, in his version of the 630 commandments, lists them on the 630, amongst the 630 commandments, because he adopts a super maximalist position, in which he argues that even the Drabbonons were transmitted from Moshe at Sinai. And they said, when this and this historic event occurs, put in place this and this mitzvah Rabbanon. Remarkable position to take. So I mention this simply to say that what I'm calling the maximalist position is the argument that everything in Torah SheBaal Peh came down from Sinai. There is a super maximalist position which can even argue Rabbanons came down from Sinai. Now again, the logic of this would be that the concept of Rabbanon is that under certain historic circumstances, it makes sense to add a layer to the Torah. So for example, the Torah says don't write on Shabbos. It doesn't say anywhere you can't move a pen around on Shabbos. This is mukta, which depends exactly how you learn the sugya, but seemingly is Rabbanon. And the logic of mukta would be very simple. If you move a pen around, then you're going to end up as writing. Whether that's the exact definition of mukta or not is a topic in its own right. But let's understand this as a classic geder, a classic fence around the Torah. So it's conceivable, you could understand a model which would argue that this is how the Torah was defined, this is how the Torah was given. That when Chazal understood that this fence was a necessary addition to add to the Torah, they should do so. We need to look, again, it's a topic of a shir by itself, the authority of rabbinical mitzvahs. But there is a super maximalist position which argues that even the Drabbonons are listed amongst the 613 commandments because even they came from Sinai.
Rabbi Zobin,
yes.
If you don't mind, I have got 3 questions for you, which have occurred to me as you're speaking. I suspect you're going to say, having said what you said in the last 5-10 minutes, that one of them is an attack on the minimalist, on the maximalist, or the maximalist on the minimalist. But I think they still need dealing with. Let me run through them very briefly, and if you don't have time in this year, perhaps if you'd be so kind in the forthcoming shiurim. The first one is this: a lot of what you've described as the machlokas is purely at a halachic level, but there are other disagreements as well. For example, historical. Did the tzitz say?
Okay, I will stop you there. We will look at non-halachic Torah SheBaal Peh in a future share.
Okay,
so I'll just say for everyone's benefit, Mark is raising the issue of we're talking about halacha, but outside and beyond halacha, there's Agadah, there's Medrash, there's historical chazals. Where do those all come from? And that we will look at.
Or even something like tzitz, Kodesh Lashem on the tzitz, one line or two, or you gave a whole series of shurim about how Hashem runs the world. Is it according to Rambam or the Baal Shem Tov? All of that. Okay, that's number one. Number two, Yaakov learned Torah for 14 years in the yeshiva of Shem Ve'eva without a Torah SheBaal Peh. So he must have learned a corpus of philosophy or something. So the first question is, was that Torah SheBaal Peh? And secondly, if it was or whether it wasn't, presumably it changed when the Torah was given, where some of the parameters of what happens in the world also changed. So presumably in looking at Torah SheBaal Peh, we need to look at that. And the third and final question is, you mentioned that the machlokas in the Gemara are all at the peripheries, at the edges. They're not so much the core. I wonder, using something you said a few weeks ago, whether that is entirely 100%. For example, you mentioned that the overwhelming majority say that, for example, Hashem doesn't have a guf, but you mentioned a reference to some great chazal, I can't remember exactly the reference, that Hashem does have a guf. Now, obviously, that's pretty core and fundamental to our understanding of Hashem, not just at the peripheries. So those are the three questions.
Thank you. Because of the limits on time, Mark, if you could just send me afterwards a brief WhatsApp note with the three questions, so I make sure I cover them. But very briefly, your first and third question both deal with the realm of philosophy as opposed to halacha, and therefore that I will get to that. Your middle question takes us well off subject, which is the proto-Torah learnt by the others. And again, I'm happy to give a series on that. If you send me a note, I can add it to my topics for Sunday morning. Sure. And maybe we can do as a more general discussion how to learn Medrash. Maybe we can do a series on the topic of how to learn Medrash. But again, that middle question I'm not going to address in this series because it's its own topic. Given that we're running out of time, I just want to give the take-home message from this year, so that next year we can start going through this topic in a more historic manner. Normally, when we deal with a topic in Torah, the correct way to deal with it is to start off with the Midrashim and the Mishnayos, then go through the Gemara, and then go through the early authorities, the Rishonim, then come to the later authorities. In this shir, I leapt straight to Samson Raphael Hirsch, simply because he was a good springboard to open the discussion. And what I've argued is that there are several positions one could adopt. The only position I've sourced so far is the maximum position of Hirsch, in which everything of Torah SheBaal Peh is part of the oral tradition handed down through the generations. And the Torah SheBaal Peh is not a derivation of these positions. You can't see it. It can't all be drawn out from Torah SheBaal Peh. Torah SheBaal Peh should be read as student notes that doesn't contain enough information. And I've mentioned briefly, but we haven't explored it, a minimalist position, the opposite pole, which will say, no, most of what we learn in Gemara is exactly what it looks like, deriving laws from the Torah, but not part of a living oral tradition. I've labeled these the maximalist position because that's the position that makes Torah SheBaal Peh, the oral tradition component of Torah SheBaal Peh, at its maximum, and a minimalist position because that's the position that makes the oral tradition of Torah SheBaal Peh as the minimum. Everyone's agreeing what's included in the corpus of Talmud. The question is how much of that is part of an oral tradition and how much that is derived from a human reading of the written Torah. And next week we will, please God, start off with a more more Torah and academic correct system and order of explaining these ideas. We'll look at Ma'amar and Chazal and try and see what the sages themselves, what did the Gemara itself say about its traditions? What do we have from the Gemara and the early authorities on the subject? So I'll stop there for now, and I wish everyone a good day. If there's any questions, I'm happy to take them. Otherwise, we'll finish.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.